This kind of thinking about war, and this kind of thinking about politics, and this kind of thinking about, well, the neighbors had to change, and that was the toughest part when the leaders of Europe, towards the end of the Second World War, decided that Europe has to change. So, compel by bullets or by words had to be changed by, well, in a way, compelled by cooperation. Cooperation instead of war was supposed to become a way of life. Cooperation eventually turned into integration, because it started with difficulties, but once it started and once it was consequently implemented, then cooperation eventually turned into integration. And in integration, the very idea of compelling kind of disappeared because it didn't make sense. It simply wasn't rational anymore. So, ladies and gentlemen, the new to the old continent, the most important new to the old continent was the overall change of thinking by Europeans and by their leaders about politics, about society, about how things should work in a society that is free of wars. So, look, Clausewitz was writing this in the 19th century. Now, in the 21st century, life in Europe is very different. It is a continent, and so far it's the only place on earth from which war as a political means has been eliminated. Instead, the Europeans replaced, and that's the additional new to Europe, something that is called Copenhagen criteria. So what it was? Well, this process of cooperation turning into integration started in 1945 or thereabouts. But it couldn't be done across the whole continent at the same time. Europe emerges from the war divided again between the West, that would be the western part of Europe, and the East. And the part of Europe we are in, it was part of the East. The East was under the control of the Soviet Union. So when Europe emerges, there is the western part of Europe that is changing, adding the new, eliminating the views of Clausewitz and many others, are starting to cooperate, but then it cannot go any further because there was the Iron Curtain, the division between the East and the West. So the integration process had to be done at stages. It had to be unfolding one step at a time, one part of Europe at a time. And when it became possible to go to the eastern part of Europe, then the process started doing exactly that, going to the east. That became possible when the Soviet Union collapsed. And those parts of Europe and those countries that belonged to the Soviet bloc or to the Soviet Union itself became independent, either regaining independence, that would be the case with Poland, or just getting independence, that would be the case of the former Soviet republics that became independent after the collapse of it. So as soon as it became possible, the Europeans in the eastern part of Europe decided that they want to be part of the integration process and the cooperation. And the western part, to make it easier for the eastern part to be eventually joining in the process of integration, came up with a to-do list, and that's what it is. Copenhagen criteria, it was a to-do list. If you do those things, then you will be ready to join the process of integration. So what are the things? What was the to-do list about? Well, if you look at the slide, you'll see. First of all, the newly minted, newly independent countries had to, as quickly as possible, set up institutions that are the foundation for democratic politics. A government that is elected and truly elected in democratic elections, based on the rule of law, respecting human political rights, rights of the minorities. In other words, they had to turn themselves into functioning democracies. To couple that with the other part on which democracy stands, market economy, those countries had to, well, equally quickly, move from what they inherited from the Soviet Union, the very weird and totally inefficient plant economy, into a market economy. Because being a functioning democracy and having a functioning market economy meant that they would be able to take on the obligations of membership. So, ladies and gentlemen, within a short period of time, and for a human being 10 years or so, it's a long time, but for societies it's just a blink of an eye, the Europeans in the eastern part of Europe had to, well, refashion themselves, and refashion themselves very quickly. What could take and did take for, say, the Germans several decades, here in this part of Europe it had to take a decade or so and no longer. So this is the list of things to do that Europeans in the eastern part of the continent had to do, and had to do it relatively quickly.